Hello everyone, thanks for coming. Welcome to Balancing Accessibility Against Depth in Assault Android Cactus.
So we're two-thirds of Team Witchbeam. I'm Tim Dawson, I'm the artist and programmer.
And I'm Santana, Mishra, designer and other stuff guy. So who we are and what we made. Well, as Tim said, we're a three-person team. We're from Brisbane, Australia, so we're very small. Our previous experience is largely in big studios in the industry, like Sega, Pandemic, and various places like that. And this is our first game after going independent and moving towards doing self-funded, self-published, and games that we're really passionate about. So we decided to make Assault Android Cactus. And the Cactus is an arcade shoot-'em-up in a very classical style, but trying to modernize a lot of the sensibilities. We're going to play a short video that kind of encapsulates what the game is all about.
Hopefully you're familiar with the game, but this is a recap.
This is Junior Constable Cactus, and I'm on approach.
This is Ruby Cactus. There's no way on board.
I think I see an opening. It's okay, folks. I do that kind of thing all the time.
So the game... That's all right, we'll just leave the video going.
We're just getting started.
Thank you very much. So as you saw, the game is very much in that arcade space, that arcade style, very colorful, very over the top, but also trying to be accessible and build something there that's of interest for players who want to spend a lot of time with it. And that's going to be the focus of this talk. Building a game that people can feel comfortable approaching while still offering something of value if you want to put 300 hours into it on your Steam account or PlayStation. So these are some of the things people have been saying about it after it came out. I stated those were our goals earlier, and this is kind of how people reacted. I don't know if you can read those up on the screen. They're pretty big, so hopefully you can. But for the most part, people have responded very well to the goals that we set out for. There's a great quote here from IGN that says, AAC is immediately accessible and thoroughly conquerable for an average player. But with extended play, it also reveals a challenging endgame for high score chasers. And this is really the core of the experience we wanted to get across to people. So it was very gratifying to see that reflected in the review scores, and the detail itself.
So the main thing is that we knew we were making a kind of slightly niche game, but we wanted to appeal to as many people as possible. We knew we had a good game. We knew we had something that would entertain people when they played it, but people come from all different backgrounds. It's easy to think about people being good players or bad players, but it's more about they come from different places. Some people played games a long time ago and are getting back into it. Some people play indie games and have particular kind of experiences from that way. And some people are hardcore twin-stick arena shooter-up fans and have certain expectations about the genre. And we kind of wanted to make a game that would be okay for all of them without basically letting anyone down. So obviously this is not a unheard of problem, trying to serve multiple people. The most standard approach is a difficulty mode. You start the game, let players pick which difficulty mode they want to go, and away they go. It gives you a lot of control over crafting content for people that's suitable for people of different skill levels. And it also gives you a bit of replayability as a bonus, because maybe they'll come back and play hard mode. The problem with that approach, especially for us, is that when your game is heavily based around balance and content tuning, making difficulty modes is almost like making the game multiple times. And it can also confuse and hide the true experience. When you're playing the game, you're thinking, well, is this the real game? Should I be playing on hard to get the actual experience? And what if someone runs through the entire game on easy? They might see a version of the game that's basically a shadow of what we actually wanted to show them. The second approach is adaptive difficulty, which is really good for some problems. It means the player doesn't have to evaluate their own skill level. It also allows you to ensure flow. When they reach a difficult point of the game can ratchet down and let them keep going. It's also quite fun to implement as from a programming point of view, because you can often come up with really cool inventive ideas, like do you add extra blocks to the level so they can jump easier, or whatever you're going to do. But it also has similar content authoring problems to having difficulty modes, and if the player detects it, it feels a bit patronizing, and it also undermines anything that's like highly score-based, because it's kind of like dragging the challenge away from them, maybe when they were just getting ready to have a proper go at it. And it's also very easy to kind of keep going down that rabbit hole.
One kind of danger that I've noticed with this approach, if you look at The Elder Scrolls Oblivion, is a great example of a game in a series where traditionally exploration was a very rewarding and satisfying feeling, and then they switched to an adaptive difficulty. They went too far down the rabbit hole, and all of a sudden the entire game was auto-leveled. It felt like no matter where you went and what you did, the experience was monotone. And they've moved away from that a lot, but that's kind of like the key danger of adaptive difficulty is your game becomes single note.
So the third approach is to go somewhat build an algorithm. Most people are probably thinking negative feedback relates more to YouTube comments, but in this case it's the opposite of positive feedback. So as you're achieving above the expectation, we want to ratchet up the tension, not so much tension, the kind of difficulty. And as you're going below it, we want to give you a boost up. And the intent of this is, with my highly scientific graph I've created here, with all real numbers, is to condense the range of people's experience into a smaller band, which we know is good. It's basically to let everyone play in the same sandbox, and it gives you that great advertising slogan, easy to play, hard to master. It's kind of what all games aspire to be able to write. The downsides is it requires a very good understanding of your dynamics, because you're basically making them play against each other. It can feel like rubber banding if you do it too much. It's like the game never feels fair. It just drags you back into the key point. And it's probably more accurate to describe it as easy to say, hard to implement.
So we ended up choosing negative feedback in Cactus. And there's a number of reasons for that I'm going to go through now. The most important one for us was that it didn't compromise the core experience. Cactus's core experience is very specific. There are very specific emotions we want you to feel, such as the overwhelming nature of the game, the sheer number of enemies that appear around you, dealing with that situation, overcoming it, and then crushing it, and these kind of like waves of elation that wash over you afterwards. That's an experience we wanted everyone who plays the game to feel, regardless of where their skill level was at. That's the crux of why this game exists. So building a system that would allow people to kind of get on at an earlier skill set and then build up from there and still have that experience was very critical. We also knew from the start that content was going to be a big roadblock for us. We're a three-person team, as we said, and that three-person team includes someone who does all the audio, all the music, all the sound effects. That does myself, who does all not all the design, a lot of the design and biz dev stuff, such as coming to GDC. Hi everyone. And Tim, who does all the programming, all the art, and a whole bunch of the design. So if you're going to build a system, you want to avoid something that requires a lot of content. So we obviously had to opt for something that would crunch that down. It scaled very well with other design decisions we made, such as implementing local co-op. Now the way that we implemented co-op was very algorithmic with a little bit of handcrafted tuning on top. And when you have 1-player, 2-player, 3-player, and 4-player as separate modes, if you're implementing selectable difficulty or scaling difficulty, that can escalate the amount of content you need to make drastically. So having an algorithmic solution on top of an algorithmic solution really allowed us to cut down on the amount of work we would need with permutations and so on and so forth. And finally, it increased the tension in the game because it's constantly kind of pushing back against the game systems and the way that you're playing. This did have some interesting side effects where it made different dynamics much more highlighted than we had anticipated, and I'm going to get into that in a second. Dominant and optimal strategies are a thing in every game, I think. Particularly high score chasing games is where you need to consider them though. In case of Cactus, we assume that every player will find the path of least resistance. This is more of a human thing than necessarily a games thing. People will optimize. They'll optimize their life. They'll optimize the route they drive to work. They'll optimize anything that they can so that it's easier, it's quicker, and it's better for them. If you respect your players, you need to assume that they're going to do this in your game. If you're designing a lot of fun, optimal, and interesting strategies, if those are not viable in some way, if they don't line up with like the best way to play your game, you're kind of losing a lot of effort there. You're wasting a lot of effort potentially. In the case of Cactus, we identified very early on that traditional shoot-'em-up style of gameplay with lives and so on and so forth would lead to players playing very defensively. The more lives you lost, the more you were afraid of failure, the more you were afraid of death. And so you would actually retreat out from the fun parts of playing the game, the chaotic action, towards, you know, I'm going to hide in this corner because there's less options for people to get at me. I'm safer, it's boring, but it's also the dominant strategy. So we wanted to find a solution for that. Now this solution is very specific to Cactus, but we think the approach and the way of thinking could apply to a lot of games. In our case, we switched out lives, we implemented a battery that's constantly draining. The only way to fail the game is if your battery actually runs all the way out. And the only way to keep your battery topped up is to defeat enemies and grab new recharge packs that drop after you've defeated enough. What this did was, as we were talking about earlier with the negative feedback, it pushes back against the kind of systems that are in the game and encourages more reckless, aggressive behavior. It corrals players towards a play space that we think is more interesting, more fun, and how people do play the game before they feel that they needed to retreat to the more static style of playing. So it aligns the dominant and optimal ways of playing the game and lets people have enjoyment while still playing efficiently. It also allows a boost for new players without really damaging the experience for anybody else. We do some things like if you're on the edge of battery failure and you collect a new one, you get an extra 10 seconds than if you'd collected one and you were doing just fine. And this doesn't really change anything. You can't game this system because you're already sort of losing if you're on the edge of failure. So it's not like there's an advantage to trying to game that. We can really just lift up the bottom end of the skill set without negatively affecting other people.
So it was very important. We wanted to bring people to this particularly high-level place of play. So what we wanted to do was create a path through the game, like a skill highway, that players could get on potentially at different levels, and it would just push them further into the game at their own pace and own level. So we have a number of success criteria. The most obvious one is when you finish a level, it goes level cleared. You've beaten the level. Hurrah, you can go to the next level if you want. And that's a very obvious one, and people feel like, yes, I've beaten the level. If they couldn't beat the level, it's obvious they have to play better. But once they get to that, they get a ranking on the score screen. And then maybe they'll get a C or a D, and they'll go, well, what do I have to do to get better? Or they'll look across and they'll see there's a score ranking that's being assessed against the leaderboards. And they'll see a friend is ahead of them, or some other person is ahead of them, or they're 160 on the leaderboards. And they say, well, what does it take to be 159? And that's supposed to get them thinking about what do they have to do to progress, because there's a lot in the game that'll help them. And if they try it again, they'll go, oh, wow, I played it so much better. The goal was to lead players from one objective to another so that they could kind of take it at their own pace and be comfortable about it. We don't want to beat them over the head and say, you must play better in order to get further in the game. We want it to be just an obvious path. And crucial to this was to make sure that all progress in the game was forwards progress. Anything you do that helps you get a better score or helps you complete the levels faster or just makes you look cooler on screen should be reflected in those other systems. If you play the game faster, if you play the game more aggressively, you get a better score, you get a better rank. It feels better. Everything aligns. And we wanted to avoid having the player to have to unlearn anything. Like, if they think that picking up power-ups really made them better, they shouldn't have to figure out that leaving power-ups in the field is a dominant strategy later on when they're getting high level. It never works like that. The rules you learn in level 1 apply all across the game. We just build and add context. And that was a really conscious decision because a lot of games can often add little kind of eddies and dead ends and stuff.
Yeah, I really wanted to avoid the scenario that I found myself in Ninja Gaiden where I'd use that jumping, swooping attack, got through half the game, and then it stopped working eventually. The bosses got too hard, and I just didn't know how to play, so I couldn't play anymore. I needed to unlearn everything that I'd learned, and that's really not something you want people to experience.
And so I mentioned the multiple criteria for success. The most explicit one further on past beating the level is getting an S+. In our game, when you chain enemies together, you get a chain counter going. And if you can chain all the enemies from the start of the level to the end of the level, you get an S+ rank, which is the highest rank in the game. And that unlocks, the first time you do it, it unlocks Pro Mode. It comes up, it's got a splash screen. And from then on, you have an indicator on your HUD that's telling you that there's an S+ available. And the moment you do something to ruin that, it'll break, to just let you know that you're not viable for an S+ anymore. And what we wanted is people to go, oh, that's a way to play, that's an objective, that's a high-level objective. And they can come back to levels that they've been before, or they can approach new levels, and they can say, my objective is to chain every enemy in a row. It becomes the high-level carrot instead of the low-level stick, which is the battery. And achieving an S+ is basically our hard mode, but it's overlaid and within the original game, and it's just there when you want it. So if you don't want to get an S+, if you just want to beat the level, you can, and that's fine. And the moment you feel up for it, you can just push ahead and try to get the S+ at any time, and it's a very organic way of letting people choose their challenge. We know that playing for an S+ is more exciting than playing the regular game. It's where the end game is, it's where we hope everyone gets to, but it's really difficult. So if we started out by saying, you have to chain every enemy and that's the game, we would have turned off so many people that were just gone, I'm out. But once they get into the game, once they understand the mechanics, that's where the skill highway kicks in and they start going, what's down the end? And along the way is the S+.
It's been really important as well that we never break the core experience, as we said earlier. So despite the S+ system and the battery system being at opposite ends of the skill scale, they actually both act in the same way. If you're on the edge of failing your battery and you're kind of racing to the next one, you're playing in this really high intensity zone that every second counts and is critical. You're just not very good at the game yet. But conversely, if you're at the top end of the skill scale and you're playing for S+, you've got 2.5 seconds between every enemy that you need to chain the next one. And it acts in a very similar way to the battery without being this, critical failure. But to you, it is a failure if you break it. So the experience is still kept the same, the core experience, despite very different skill sets. We also identified very early on that we wanted players to make important and meaningful decisions, and part of that became that we built a cast of characters. So by having a cast of characters, we could push them very far apart from each other, create them, make them unique, give them different personalities, different dialogue, and different weapon sets that would really push them apart the way that you see characters in a fighting game potentially. And by having these different characters, we could appeal to many different player types. So, you might think that Cactus is the best character ever, but the person sitting next to you is thinking, well, actually, Holly is the best character ever. And that's very viable. It's very important that people can feel that way about the different characters because that adds real value to them. And it's crucially important if you're going to do this, if you're going to try and add variety for the sake of it, you need to make sure that they're balanced or else the value is not particularly meaningful. If Starch is actually the best character, everyone's going to play Starch. And that's just how it is because people will find that path of least resistance. They'll find the easy way or the best way to play the game and they'll exploit it. We also did early access for over a year, which was very interesting. There could be a whole other talk on that one day, but primarily I'm going to talk here about what came out of it from the community. There was a lot of discussion of tier lists, who's the best character, who's the worst character. I'm sure that Holly is the best character, by the way, in case anyone wonders. And, people would discuss this, and it encouraged a lot of investigation, invention, and the character choices became a point of pride. I remember one time there was a streamer named Solon who was a particular fan of Coral, and he was just playing Coral on his stream trying to get some good scores, and he discovered this really cool tactic against the second boss, Vespula, where he could pop into the middle and drop his plasma field, and it protected him completely from her wasp attacks, and also killed them hyper efficiently. He actually got the rank 1 worldwide score on his stream, and people were very happy about it. They're very excited at a time when no one thought Coral was even viable for scores. So, people started discussing, oh, is Coral actually the best at score chasing? She can get lots of multi-kills. She can, do all these different interesting things. And the game changed without the game actually changing. People's perception of the game changed. And we do a lot to encourage this, like showing the icon of which character you're using on the leaderboard associated with your score, so people can go, oh, I guess that's the best character, and then tomorrow someone else puts a higher score with a different character, and all of a sudden your perceptions of the world are broken.
One of the great things about developing a game with an active leaderboard, as we did in early access, was that when people maintain, they go, this character is broken, they just have an overwhelming lead. We can say prove it. And yeah, unless you can put that character at the top of every leaderboard, which we never saw happen, which was very gratifying. It meant that our design was constantly in that kind of flux where it would, characters were all viable.
And finally, with characters, we think that good design leaves everyone feeling like a little bit of a cheater. So if you feel that you're pulling one over on everyone else by picking the character that you do, as is the case with a lot of Starch players, I'm just saying you're a bit of a scrub, then that's good for us. That's exactly what we wanted out of this. You know, we want you to feel like your character is the best character because you identify with them. And that's really a good feeling.
So basically every part of the game was designed to kind of advance the core function of the game, which was to make it accessible, to make it exciting, to draw people in, including the aesthetic. And so just for the gameplay, the way the game plays was designed around maximizing visual clarity. Because we have a very chaotic game, it's very fast, a lot of things are happening very suddenly. It's important that enemies have clear silhouettes, they all move in a unique way, and when they go off screen, they get off-screen indicators so that you can tell where enemies are at any given time. The bullets are color-coded. You can tell whether it's going to hit a player, an enemy, or both by its color. And we just try to use as much clear signification in the game as possible to kind of reinforce that. Anything visual generally has an audio cue or some other cue. Anything audio has some sort of other kind of way of representing it. And the main thing was to make the game more parsable when you start seeing it initially, but also it really helps the beginners more than the advanced players. Advanced players will get used to stuff. They'll work out the timing in their head. They'll have no problem. But for a beginner, they're going to take in all of these cues, and they might not understand it. They might say the game looks confusing and they haven't quite got their head around it yet. But unconsciously and peripherally, they're taking all this information in, and it's basically for them.
And the side bonus to that is that players who have trouble hearing can experience your game as well if you're focused on making sure you have all these cues in every type of sensory input. So we've had some comments from people who can't hear very well saying they really like the game and they enjoy that there's nothing hidden from them.
And just even the tone of the game was designed around this. It has a sense of humor. You know, if you saw from the opening cutscene with the crashing and stuff like that, you're supposed to laugh at bits. The game doesn't take itself 100% seriously, but it's not a joke. You can take it seriously to a degree. You can look at this and say, this is a genuine action game. Things are exploding, rockets are flying across the screen, giant bosses are threatening people's lives. This is, you know, it's a video game, but it's designed to be accessible in that way. We didn't want to turn away people by showing a grim, nasty, people getting their heads cut off. We hoped that we could thrill people with the explosions, but also draw them in with the warmth of the characters. And so by extension, the characters are meant to be lively. They're meant to be a bit kind of wacky, or kind of, well, not all of them, but like some of them are a bit quirky. Some of them have really strong personalities, and you can identify with that. Or you can just go, these are really good action characters that are really capable and really cool. And all those interpretations are valid at the same time, and that was intentional in order to try to make sure that nobody felt really left out when they started playing the game.
So despite our best intentions, as is always the case, you have to learn lessons. You will fail along the way, or you will meet unexpected things. So I'm going to go over some of those now. As I said earlier, we did early access for quite a long time. We also showed the game at a lot of conventions. We've done PAX Prime 3 times, PAX East, PAX Australia twice. We've been to E3, Gamescom, Eurogamer Expo. Everything you could imagine, at some point or another, someone's had Cactus there over the last couple of years. And out of that, we've learned a lot about parsing feedback from people, because it does come in all different, you know, shapes and sizes. Primarily, what we learned from the early access community is that the people who already buy into your game are willing to give it more of an attempt. They're willing to like put up with stuff that isn't very good and just go through and figure it out and get to the good part of your game. So I wouldn't look for too much interesting, useful feedback on your tutorial from people who've already put down $15 and 10 hours into your game. But people who are at a conference or at a convention, they're playing 30 to 50 games that day. They're playing them for 10 minutes each. They'll not hesitate to tell you if they don't get something. They'll put down the controller and walk away. So it's really great to kind of like take the right feedback from the right groups of people and learn from that. So yeah, we definitely learned from the hardcore veterans on the early access as well as the first-time players. And there's a number of changes we made. I remember the tutorial The tutorial had to change at one point because people kind of just weren't getting it at conventions and conferences. And after we changed it and we made it a little bit more easy to understand, all of a sudden people at the conferences were playing it and saying, oh yeah, that's really great. This game is immediately understandable. You don't even need a tutorial. But we know that wasn't true because we even had a tutorial before and yet they still didn't get it. So it was quite useful to get that information. We also learned a lot about how players perceive the difference between difficulty and frustration. Like, something being hard is all right, something being frustrating is bad. With our third boss, Justice, he has only 3 phases. Most of the bosses have 6 or more phases, and the boss fight length is roughly the same. That means that his phases are very long. They're very difficult to get through. And when we first put him into the game, a lot of players would face Justice, they'd get halfway or more through the first phase, they'd die, and they'd feel like they've made no progress, and it would really make them angry. And they would let us know, because that's what people on Steam will do. They will let you know. And so we went back to the drawing board, and we were like, well, how can we fix this without breaking what we think is really interesting about this 3-phase boss? We did a number of things. We adjusted the first phase so that he had more power-up spawning from the laser fence emitters that popped up around him. That made people feel like they had more options to choose from in how to tackle the problem. We reduced the number of kind of these capture balls that he would spawn out that would soak up a lot of bullet fire, so that you could spend more time shooting the boss and feeling like you were progressing to the next element. And we rebalanced his health so that he had less in phase 1 and more in 2 and 3. The overall difficulty remained the same, but people's frustration went drastically down. So really thinking about the difference between something being hard and something being frustrating without necessarily changing what you want people to experience. We also found that different players react very differently to how you use bullets. So we have a boss, the 4th boss of the game, Venom. He uses a lot of bullet patterns. And initially he used something closer to what you might call bullet fields. He's just spraying bullets everywhere. And this kind of disadvantaged players who came from an action game background, who weren't used to this. People who play a lot of bullet hell can get a pattern of bullets out of anything and recognize it and figure out where they need to be. But that's not necessarily true for people who haven't put 300 hours into Donpachi. So what we did was we went back and redesigned his attacks. Same number of bullets, same amount of screen coverage, just in much more recognizable patterns. And this ended up allowing us to actually make them harder in some ways, while still keeping it fair because it was more of a universal challenge that people of all different backgrounds of gaming types could attack in the same way. Humans are very good at pattern recognition. And finally, it's just sometimes it takes a nudge. I remember showing the game at South by Southwest to children. It was a gaming convention, but it's also people who don't play video games show up there en masse in the thousands because it's open to everyone. It doesn't cost anything. And the kids would come up and they would play the game. They'd play a level and they would die over and over and over. And they'd play for an hour. And they were really happy playing because they loved the game, they loved the characters, they loved the action, they liked shooting things. They didn't really care that they would die and play the same level. That was kind of just like the game to them. But it wasn't because they were lacking skill. They just didn't recognize what was important, what was not important. They weren't collecting batteries and things like that. So we ended up doing a little bit of help where we put the word collect above the battery the first 3 times you see it. And anytime you miss it, that word comes back again. And that actually helps so many people just understand, in a world of flashing colors and lights and collectibles, this one's the most important. Go get it. Sure, you can just wait a little while and get it, but really, get that. And it just helped so much. We also added death tips, which come up at the end of a stage if you failed. But they only come up if you've actually completely failed to use mechanics in the game, like your secondary weapon or collecting batteries. We didn't want to make people feel uncomfortable if they were giving the game the best shot and just falling short because it's hard. You don't want people to feel like you're harassing them to do better all the time. So only showing the tips when people absolutely failed to grasp core concepts was a great way to boost the low-end players without affecting other people again.
So in conclusion, so we thought it was very important not to sacrifice one type of player to appease another. So we knew we had a game that we wanted to bring to a lot of people, but we absolutely didn't want to sacrifice the high-level gameplay. We didn't want to let people that were expecting something skill-based to kind of be underserved because we were trying to reach out to other people. We wanted to bring those people up to the skill level of the high-skill people.
Yeah, and Another critical aspect is treating your players with respect, understanding that they're probably very intelligent, even if they don't get aspects of your game. It's usually the game's fault if people don't understand something. So one aspect of this was the secondary weapon that cools down very quickly, and we want you to use it because it does a lot of damage, and you kind of need to use it to beat the bosses. And for a long time, people weren't getting it, so we added a lot more feedback to it. We've got like this steam that jettisons out the back of the characters. We've got an audio cue when it finishes recharging. We've got a meter that's under the feet that travels with the character. And, you know, it might be overkill, but it's not, because when we didn't have all these things working in unison, players didn't get it. And when we did, they did get it. And it wasn't because the concept was complex. It was because the game wasn't giving you all the information you needed to actually solve the problem of, when and how do I use my secondary weapon? So treating players with respect and kind of like understanding the game needs to do its job too is very important.
It was very important to have a lot of empathy with our players as well, particularly people that are not really clicking with the game. If you see someone struggling, you want to understand what they're actually looking for in the game, or why they're having problems with the game. A lot of the time they might say, this level is too hard, I don't have enough time to finish it. But what they actually mean is they're not playing aggressively enough, and there's something that's not pushing them to do that. They're either not using their secondary, they're not using power-ups. And so being able to put ourselves in their shoes and understand that what they're seeing is frustrating, but their solution is something else, was really important for the design aspect.
Yeah, you need to understand that people are rarely ever wrong about how they feel, but they're wrong a lot of the time about why they feel that way. That's just how emotions work. So having empathy that people really do feel this way, maybe they're not telling you the best solution to fix the problem for them because they're saying, you know, remove the battery, change something drastic, but having that empathy to respect that they really do feel that way is important. And finally, this kind of should go without saying, but it's the crux, the end goal, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Have an end game that's worth reaching and keep it in sight. So you need to consider all the way through development, why are you making these changes? Why are you trying to make your game accessible? What are you trying to build people towards? What do you want them to find after 200 hours? You spend a lot of time convincing people that your game is worth playing, that they can play it, that they should play it. So what are they working towards? What are they actually going to experience? In Cactus, a lot of that came down to the S+ system, to this kind of chase for perfection, the razor edge between success and failure that's very thrilling while you're playing this addictive, you know, kind of gameplay. And it could be anything in any other game, but you really need to keep it in sight all the time because you can lose it very easily. And that is the end of the talk.
Thank you.
I'm supposed to remind you to fill out questionnaires, and also you should have turned off your cell phones, but it's a bit late. Not sure if we have any time for questions, but maybe one or two if anybody has any.
2 questions. Questions?
So I just want to say I had a ton of fun with the game in the middle. It's just when I got to the last boss, I started doing this really ugly thing where I would just pull out Cactus, unload the flamethrower, die, pop up, unload the flamethrower, just because, let's say I could get through each phase 80% of the time, but like, oops, I oopsed in phase 3, or I oopsed in the very last thing, and eventually I was just like, I'm out. Is there any way to balance the really hard boss type stuff at the end? Or what kind of considerations do you do to make it fun, but like you won't win 100% of the time, but you don't have to resort to like ugly tactics or feeling like you're going to lose in the different phases?
It's a very, very tough thing to do, is balancing the end game of your game against people who are kind of struggling. In our case, we wanted to consistently ramp up the difficulty. We kind of had a difficulty curve that went 1, 2, 3, 6, and like spikes up for the boss, and then it drops down to 4, which is kind of above where it was in the regular levels before, and then builds up again. With regards to the last boss itself, in terms of how you can balance that so that you could get through it without really, you know, excelling to the point where you're kind of good enough to do it, I'm kind of okay if people can't necessarily beat the boss. I don't think we made a game that's about seeing all the content in the game. We made a game that's largely about playing the game, experiencing it, improving yourself, and feeling that reward that comes from the innate gameplay. Tim, do you have any comments?
Ideally, the phases of the boss also almost represent achievement in themselves. Seeing the boss, and that was what Knight was talking about with the third boss. was that once you see a boss break and change phase, that can feel like an achievement in itself. You've made some progress, even if you fail the level. And the kind of hope is that it can be interesting to come back and see if you can push further. Can you beat a phase with more time available? And that's actually the way that you beat the boss, because each boss is basically a start over. And so you can kind of ratchet yourself through the battles if you keep at it. But obviously, sometimes that doesn't kind of register, and it's it's an issue. But we did what we could to try to signpost the mechanics as much as we could.
To help out the noob players that the advanced players then complained about or were frustrated by. You mentioned putting the word collect above batteries if you miss it, and I can see someone who is familiar with the game being frustrated. Like, I know I'm supposed to get that. Shut up.
I was super worried about that. So the way we implemented it was it shows up the first 5 times the battery appears, and then it goes away. And it only comes back when you miss a battery, so the next battery shows up with collect on it.
It actually ends up working out in the favor of advanced players, because if you ever see the word collect above the battery again, it lets you know that you missed one. And you might not have noticed that you missed one if you're playing for that S Plus and all you're focused on is chaining the enemies together. Sure, you should have seen it, but maybe you didn't. So if you see collect, it immediately clicks in your head that, oh, I missed one, I'm probably going to be low battery now, I need to make sure I grab that one. So it worked out in the end where it's actually benefiting them.
Did they complain about anything in particular that you did for accessibility purposes, or not really?
No, not really, because we focused on not harming their experience by helping new players. That was always like a pillar that you could compare an idea against. You could say, if we're going to do this and we're going to make the game easier for someone to get into, is this going to hurt people who are playing at the top end? And we chose not to hurt those people because we wanted, if you put in the time to get there, we want your experience to be the best experience it can be.
A way I thought about it was I had empathy for the people who were learning the game, but I was the advocate for the people who were at the end game. And they were my number one.
The goal is for everyone to end up at the end game. Sure, that's unreasonable and not actually going to happen, but you strive for perfection. It's like the goal to not crunch, but then it kind of happens sometimes.
Thanks, guys.
I wanted to clarify the difference between adaptive difficulty and negative feedback. I mean, they both use some kind of metric, success metric, and basically ramp up or scale down the difficulty. But what's the ultimate difference?
The main difference is it's algorithmic or system-based. It's like a system that just gets harder as you get up or goes down lower. Adaptive difficulty generally has some sort of specific track or specific thing that changes.
It also usually involves a lot more authored content for specific adaptive difficulty, and the points at which it change are very distinct rather than a kind of gradual element that you can control. I mean, that's from our point of view, I guess.
So there are just more parameters that can scale linearly.
Yes and no. Like the example of the battery time. The battery is worth more battery when you have less battery. So that just scales very evenly. So it's not like the game's detected you're playing badly and given you a better battery. Well, it kind of has, but it's on that very much a clear curve. And the game never has to acknowledge that you played badly. It's just a aspect that comes out of it. To me, that was the crucial difference between an adaptive difficulty mode, which might decide to give you a bonus battery, and a negative feedback, which just pushes against low battery.
The game also never changes what it's asking you to do, regardless of the battery systems and feedback pushing against you. You still have to destroy all the enemies. You still have to make it through the level. The gameplay itself doesn't change. The core experience is always the same.
Thank you.
Cool.
All right,
okay,
I think that's it. So thank you very much.